Now, in the lead up to the federal election, whenever that may be called, there are growing calls for the major parties to focus on climate resilience. Essentially, that's Australia's ability to adapt and respond to weather events just like this. Alfred, which is tracking towards the east coast. One of those independent MPs behind these calls is Zali Steggall. She joins me here in the not windy studio, which is nice to be in the comfort of the studio rather than on the east coast. I want to talk about Alfred and what this resilience actually means, because we are starting to see weather events like this. We've spoken about Lismore 6 or 7 times that it's flooded. What can be done now?
Well, what we know is governments are always playing catch up, right? The bulk of the cost to the economy is going into emergency response, and that is significant. It's about 38 billion on average per year that goes towards disaster and emergency response. But only about 1% of that is spent on preparation to avoid or mitigate the next disaster that is likely to come. And unfortunately, we know that's happening, right? We know disasters are happening at a greater scale and a greater frequency. And communities do not have the ability to build that resilience and adapt. We rely a lot on volunteer services, and local governments are left really holding the bag. So for a community...
Governments are the ones that know their area the best, though, right?
Absolutely.
So they need to be empowered.
Well, they need to be funded is the real question.
Sure. But to do what, practically? Before we get to the climate change argument.
Sure. Practically, it may well be that they need do flood levies, they need to do banks, they need to have greater pumping facility when their flooding or water surges occur. Every community will have different needs, and that's why it's so important to map it out and have adaptation plans in place.
Now, when you talk about adaptation plans, you don't want to gold plate things that are not going to be used, right? So are you talking about being able to prepare, put things in place that are temporary, or do you think there should be permanent structures? Because they're way more expensive.
Well, this isn't about gold plating. This is about actually helping individuals and local government areas address this increasing risk. So we know insurance premiums are a massive impact on people, and we know the research is now saying 1 in 5 people are likely to be uninsured or underinsured. And that means the bulk of their wealth that they've accumulated over their lifetime of working in their home is at risk when these events occur. And that is just dramatic and I think unacceptable. So we need to mitigate the risk and to lower those insurance premiums. So how we can do that is by funding resilience. But again, you don't want to just throw funding at willy-nilly at any spot. You want to have clear risk assessments, national risk assessments done, and a clear plan by the government of the day to meet that risk and adapt to it. And that's why I think it should be legislated, and why it's important that we have this in place before disasters strike. Because if not, we are always playing catch-up. And for every $1 we invest in prevention, so ensuring the areas have the infrastructure necessary to minimise damage, we save $11 on recovery. So there is a real resilience dividend in investing in that preparation.
So when you're talking about the preparation, because preparation is being done now, and you can see, it's quite extraordinary to see. We've got some great people in Canberra, in these departments, and also in both states that know how to do it. They've done this kind of thing before. So, you know, you've got pre-positioned helicopters, you've got hundreds of thousands of sandbags. What more can be done, and what are you talking about in terms of the permanent nature of it?
Well, I guess respectfully, what's being done is last-minute emergency measures, right? We're talking about individual families having to sandbag their house, for example. Things like building codes that acknowledge the greater risk of flooding to ensure that we don't keep building in floodplains, that we don't keep building houses that aren't going to cope.
So you're talking about building better?
I think we need to build better. We need to plan better.
Isn't that happening, though?
Not nearly as fast as what is required. In bushfire zones, it is different adaptation that's needed. But also local governments need to have maybe better pumping infrastructure so that you can clear water out better. Stormwater, services. There are a huge amount of adaptation measures that can be undertaken, which are way beyond a few sandbags that the SES help you with your household.
But when you're talking about adaptation for floods or fires or things like that, it's easy to change the code for new homes that are being built, but I mean, people are struggling with the cost of living anyway. If a council or federal government was to turn around and go, actually, you've now got to invest another 8, 10, 20 grand in making sure that your house is X, Y, and Z in the event of a flood in the next 10 years. You know,
but the reality
really
is people
difficult.
are paying for this. So
Who
people
pays for that, though?
Individuals
the federal
are already
government,
but individuals are already paying for it. They are left to hold the bag because they either have insurance premiums that go up by 100, 150% if they are in a high risk area, or they have to play roulette and risk the fact that they may not be insured, and then they risk losing everything. And then government has to step in with emergency funding. So this is costing everyone already. The question is, can we do it in a smarter way and actually invest in prevention so that we don't have such a dramatic impact when these events happen? And sadly, we know these events are going to happen more frequently, at a greater scale, bigger impact each time, and that risk is escalating. And so there is a duty on government to have a safety plan, right? We talk about defence internationally. We need a domestic safety plan when it comes to climate risk.
I knew you were going to say that because you sent me the Australian Institute stuff before this interview. So I just wanted to bring up a CSIRO report that I saw yesterday that spoke about the impact of cyclones, and essentially it has said that it's on page 1586 if you want to reference it a little later, and it says landfall frequency over Australia shows a decreasing trend in eastern Australia since the 1800s, as well as in other parts of Australia since 1882. A paleoclimate proxy reconstruction shows that the recent levels of tropical cyclone interactions along the Australian coastline are the lowest in the past 550 to 1500 years. So what is the climate impact of this cyclone?
Well,
how can you definitively say, is the science really settled on that?
Well, we know that with warming, so with every 1 degree of warming, we have 7% more humidity in the atmosphere. So what that does is it supercharges events. It means when we have rain events, we have rain bombs in communities, and that overwhelms stormwater clearing capacity. We know storms. It's great if cyclones are less frequent. Unfortunately, go and say that to the Lismore community is meeting flooding
they're
event
saying
after flooding
the
event.
impact of cyclones is the lowest it's been. I mean, so we've basically got conflicting views about the impact of climate change. But even if that,
I don't know if I'd agree with that, because we know from scientists overwhelmingly around the world that all weather events are being exacerbated. So you look at the LA fires.
The CSIRO didn't say that though when it comes to cyclones.
But that might be cyclones. We know bushfires, floods, droughts. We know everything is being exacerbated. Experts talk about it in terms of climate whiplash events, where you go from extremes. And the meaning of extremes is that the impacts will be greater when they hit. And I think it's a responsibility of government to keep communities safe by preparing for those risks, acknowledge those risks. We can't leave households alone to pay for this or play roulette with their assets by not having them insured.
But you've got to admit that as we move towards the Paris targets, even if we do achieve those, I think 2030 is looking completely unachievable at this point, but let's argue about that at another time. Even if it was achievable, I mean, it's too little too late. I mean, it's not going to change the insurance premiums for people right now if we spend billions upon billions more on climate change, because it can't be reversed.
I think we need to be clear about what
Isn't that the warning?
No, but we need to be clear about
what can't be reversed.
What are the targets that matter? The targets that matter are the temperature goals, right? We have already passed the 1.5 limit, and that was not a target. That is a really clear warning of events that will cascade and that will escalate. We need to do everything we can to limit how much further we go when it comes to warming, which means every little bit of action counts. You look at it from an insurance point of view, they price risk. They price the likelihood of an event occurring and the scale at which it may have happened. Now, we cannot insure our way out of the climate crisis, I can assure you that. And they will every year reassess the likelihood of events occurring, and premiums will keep going up. And that is how individual families are paying for it. And I don't think that's acceptable. And so we have to mitigate that risk by reducing emissions as a matter of urgency.
I get that, but I mean, isn't it a little bit ironic as well, Zali, when you see a cyclone like this, solar power isn't getting into the grid, and and wind turbines don't work either in a cyclone.
Sure, and I think coal-fired power stations are likely to break down as well.
So, and then we're going to need diesel generators to power all these homes in Lismore for the next couple of weeks.
What in fact is interesting is when these events happen, communities get isolated and cut off, and that becomes the importance of having microgrids where you can have localised sort of, if people have batteries and their own generation, they actually are then able to maintain that communication. So I think our system has to evolve to address these risks, and that is part of national adaptation planning.
Okay, so it's more about adaptation. Before I let you go, we could speak for another hour on this, but we won't. Election timing. Anthony Albanese can't really be in Canberra calling an election on Monday, can he, when all this is going on?
Well, look, all indicators had been for, I was assuming probably a 12 April election. We were calling it on Sunday.
I think everyone
Monday.
Was.
But obviously, I think flexibility is important, and there is a very significant,
If
disaster
you were him,
unfolding.
would you do it?
Oh, there's a lot of things I would do differently if I was him. But
if you were him now, you'd just go to a budget and go in May, wouldn't you? And focus on the Northern Rivers in Queensland.
Well, I think that he needs to, look, I welcome the fact that he and his government are currently focusing on the communities impacted, and they are preparing. What I would say, though, is in the last budget, very little money was invested by his government on preparation. And so this is a great opportunity to commit to investing in significant adaptation and preparation.
Well, we saw that in the communication system. Here we are 3 years later and it's not working.
Exactly. And adaptation...
Do you know anything about that? What a joke.
A risk assessment plan was due to be released last year by the government. Keeping in mind we haven't had a decent one since 2015, so that's both sides are responsible for the lack of planning. It still hasn't been released. Look, in the context of what's happening, it may well come now as a matter of urgency. But I would call on both sides, right? I haven't heard from the coalition any commitment or policy around addressing.
We're not in a campaign yet.
I think realistically we all know that we are.
Yeah, well, that's right. We'll see. I don't think this weekend. Zali, good to talk to you. Thank you.